Hi, everybody. My name is Cheryl Chung, and I'm the Program Director of Executive Education Singapore Futures at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. So earlier this year, as many of you will know, we launched our new webinar series, Futures Forward, and we're hoping to really discuss a range of public policy applications of futures thinking across a wide range of topics. So we really are so thankful for this thriving community of futures thinkers and practitioners who are really putting their ideas and experiences out into the world, and are so glad that all of you are here and part of the conversation today. So today, for the third episode now, we've got this wonderful panel, and we will be talking a little bit about developing the next generation of futurists. So for those of you who do follow our work, you know that actually normally we're in the executive education business, and normally we do teach working professionals. But over the last month especially, but in the last 2 years, kind of more broadly, we've had such a wonderful opportunity to work with young people. And I think it's been such an interesting, dynamic and just wonderful chance for us to also just bring futures thinking to a slightly different audience. So if you would just allow me to introduce the panel very briefly, you'll hear much more from them later. But we're so happy to have 3 panelists and 1 wonderful invited guest. So the first person on the panel is Copeland, the Director for London Office of Technology and Innovation. So he was involved in our very first youth program in 2019, when we could still do international events face-to-face. Imagine that. So I'm really happy to welcome him back. And then we have Farah Sanwari, who's in addition to being the partnership catalyst at SpudnikLab, is also one of our Executive Education Singapore Futures Fellows. And she's been really instrumental as part of the teaching and training team for our wonderful Youth Futures month of June, helping to train, I think, probably total about 170 young people from all across Asia. So that's been really wonderful. And then the third panelist we have is Mervin, who was the chairperson of the Asian Undergraduate Summit. I think we hosted 120 of our NUS University partners, for a week-long futures workshop, and that was really wonderful as well. And then we have featuring a very special guest, and I do hope you'll give her a really, really warm welcome, Mariah Tamayo, who was a member of the winning team of our inaugural Singapore Futures Youth Competition, which only ended last Friday. So the notice that we've given her that she's going to speak on this international webinar has been quite short. But we'd really love to start with her. Hope that's okay. And if, Mariah, you can share with us a little bit of your experience, with our youth event and the youth competition last week, that would be really, really wonderful. So over to you, Mariah, if that's okay.
Thank you. And just like to thank everyone for making their time out of their busy schedules to attend this webinar. So yeah, just to reiterate, I'm Mariah, and today I guess I'll be sharing a little bit about my experience with this whole Futures Youth competition. So I guess to give a little background on how I came to know about this whole competition, I was introduced to it through my teacher, who approached me and some of my friends. And honestly, in the beginning, when I first heard of the idea of policy making and futures thinking, I was really, really intimidated, because in all honesty, I had no idea what futures thinking was. And to hear that we'd be spending a whole week learning about it and shaping up a presentation on it, it was a little daunting. But I guess giving it a little more thought and actually going on into looking through the application page, I realized that perhaps it would be something that could bring forth a lot of new insight for me especially. And I think what really piqued my interest was the fact that prior to the competition, we had to submit this introductory essay on any kind of public policy challenge that we were particularly interested in. And I think especially given our generation, where there's so many things happening, and I guess people really do get excited talking and sharing about their opinions on current affairs, I felt that this competition would be a really wonderful way to invite people like me, youths, to have our share and our space in expressing our voices and opinions on so many wonderful issues like this. And yeah, I felt that through this competition, I'd also be able to get inspired by the many diverse opinions and unique thoughts of other people. And yeah, as you can see from this board, this is the little summary of the idea that my group came up with. So for us, we decided to focus on the central idea of recreation, as well as its importance in building on community spirit in Singapore. So initially, we couldn't really find a link between the ideas of recreation and community spirit because we felt that those were two diverse topics that didn't necessarily connect with one another. But I think going back to the idea of listening to one another and hearing their thoughts, we really came to discover newfound insights on how we could further give depth to our idea. And yeah, as we grew to talk more about recreation, we realized and came to the general consensus that recreation was more so an activity that was quite self-indulgent, especially in this day and age. It was more so a me activity and one that's meant for me as a person alone to de-stress and relax by myself. And we felt that that was something we wanted to change in the far future, where we'd like the recreational landscape to be more relational and more people-centered, I guess. And yeah, that led us to the whole planning process where we decided to integrate technology as a means to bring people together and generally construct our whole basis of building the future into three different categories. One that allows recreation to be more people-centered, one that allows recreation to have more spatially effective designs, as well as recreation being more mentally well for the people. And that was a message that we like to promote. And I guess throughout this competition, we realized that this is no perfect solution, and there really are many complex factors to consider when constructing an ideal future for Singapore and, by extension, the larger community that we're in. But I'd say it was a really wonderful experience to spend like the whole week turning our once abstract idea into something that's a little more solidified. And yeah, I guess to talk more about the competition as a whole, I'd say that the most memorable part of it really was listening to the many participants that were taking part in it too, because I think it really is an amazing sight to see so many people my age gather together in different groups, especially coming from different walks of life, different places in Singapore and in different schools, just come together and spend these few days to curate a really wonderful presentation about so many different issues that they're all passionate about. And I think it's especially important now to invite youths to the table and introducing them to conversations like these, especially since in due time, we'll be the ones spearheading the progress of the future. And yeah, I guess overall, it's the whole integration of creative thinking and whole planning process that really made this competition quite a memorable one. Yeah, thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing that. I think for me, I mean, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. Like I think for me, the most gratifying thing was just like also watching different groups and different diverse groups kind of get into it, you know, because on Monday they started kind of not thinking about futures at all and not really having, you know, kind of exposure to the tools of futures, right? Which is maybe not so commonly used or commonly understood in the youth context, you know. So we tend to think about futures thinking as comprising a couple of different parts, right? So the kind of questioning the assumptions about the future, which is like what you said about recreation, right? Like, does it have to be framed in this kind of self-indulgent way, or can we reframe recreation in another way in the future, you know? And, you know, like the different trends, the different kind of possible scenarios that it might look like. And ultimately, actually, what can we do today to try to create that different or better future? Would you be able to share maybe one or two personal takeaways that you might have had from this week? I know it was only last week, so not a lot of time to reflect, but any kind of things that have been percolating in your mind since we last saw you on Friday?
I'd say one of the biggest takeaways for me personally is to really understand the value in listening to what other people think, especially since I guess everyone has different lived realities that they've been through. All of them have different experiences that they've gone through. And because of that, they all come together in their own unique way of thinking and their own personal insights onto many different topics. And I think, especially since this competition brought around so many different diverse groups of people, and all of which came across with really, really wonderfully unique ideas, I think it was really great to understand just how impactful one's voice can be, especially when it concerns pretty abstract ideas such as the future. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much for that. Yeah, our team tried very hard to kind of bring in that diversity and kind of provide it, that platform. And I'm so glad that you could see the execution end of it. So really, really thank you for that. Thank you so much. Okay,
Thank you.
let's go move on to Eddie, if that's okay. And I realized in my excitement of getting the show on the road, I forgot to tell people about the housekeeping kind of ground rules, but you will, if you're not familiar with the Zoom webinar functions, you will notice that there is both a chat function as well as the Q&A. So generally in these types of events, I will go through all the panelists and ask them to share, just as I've asked Mariah to share a little bit. And then the second half of the webinar, we really want to open it up to all of you. So please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A function. It's a little bit easier for us to manage seeing the questions from there, and then we can address them in the second half of the webinar, if that's okay. All right, I'm going to move on to Eddie, if that's all right. And Eddie and I, let's see, Eddie and I met in 2018, actually. And I happened to be in London where Eddie had given a talk on designing public services on Mars, right? And the premise of the talk was, of course, if you could think about kind of throwing out some of these assumptions about what public services look like, and thinking about that on Mars, then what can we, how more innovative can we be in public service delivery, we loved that plot device so much that we invited him back. We invited him to Singapore in 2019, where we had the opportunity to collaborate on our very first Futures workshop for young people. So at that time, I think we had 75 young people from all across Asia, NUS partner universities, as well as our local pre-university students. So we had such a great time imagining what housing, transport, and education would look like on Mars. So Eddie, if you can just introduce yourself briefly and also share a little bit about that experience. I think you've had, unlike poor Mariah, who's had 2 days to think about what this means, you've had maybe closer to 1.5 years. So I'm really curious as to your reflections about what kind of insights that might have given you about developing the next generation of futurists. Over to you, Eddie.
Well, thank you for inviting me on to the panel. So yes, I'm Eddie, and I look after an organisation called the London Office of Technology and Innovation. So we help public sector reform right across London, trying to provide better public services for residents and visitors here. And for me, going back a couple of years to support that group of young people thinking through what I felt was a ridiculously hard thought experiment. And although it may sound wacky, I think a lot of those principles, as you've said, Cheryl, are exactly the kinds of things governments need to be thinking about. What should public services look like? Why are they the way they are? And is it because they have to be that way, or can we change who's involved, on what terms they're provided, the way that they're conducted, the branding around them, what they mean to people, and the role they play in people's psychology and wider life? And as Mariah so beautifully put it, what I found remarkable was how this group of people, who'd, I think, very few had any contact with each other before, came from very different backgrounds and were presented with this ridiculously hard thought experiment, and they absolutely knocked it out the park. As Cheryl said, I'd given that presentation in a UK setting for an audience who sort of smiled and nodded politely. This audience, though, or this group of young people, came up with the policy recommendations, you know, the constitutional implications. They did physical prototypes. I remember sort of looking at pods and trying to look at what the housing, education and transport looked like. And I think the creativity on display was really, really, you know, hit me profoundly. And in fact, I called Cheryl, was about 6 months ago now, just to say, of all the things I've done over the last couple of years, witnessing that was such an eye-opener. And I think reflecting on it from this vantage point, I think two things strike me. One is that I used to be a teacher here in the UK. I used to teach sort of 17 and 18-year-olds international politics. And I remember that so much of many countries' education systems is about sort of slightly teaching by rote. It's like, this is what you need for the exams, you know, regurgitate this and you'll get through just fine. That is totally ill preparing young people for the reality of the workplace, where it isn't about recalling stuff by rote. It's not what's the template answer. It's about exactly what that workshop did. It's about the deep lateral thinking, real creativity, bringing lots of creative minds together and figuring out things where there is no obvious answer. And the final thing I'd just say is, you know, now working on public sector reform right now, as we've all seen over the last year with COVID, every typical part of the rule book has been thrown out the window. Now more than ever, we have conclusively shown this isn't about producing the rote answer. It isn't about saying, well, this has worked for 30 years, so let's do more of this. We're having to think incredibly creatively, incredibly laterally about what we want, how we can do things differently. And the point of future thinking is to make sure, let us not sleepwalk accidentally into a worse future or a suboptimal future, or just reverting to how things have always been. Let us consciously and creatively design it to be better. Public servants today are not naturally inclined to do that. More of them are trying to understand these methods, and it gives me such pleasure to know there's young people like Mariah out there who are learning these skills, because we need them. We badly, badly need them. And so delighted to see this program continuing, and let's have a lot more of it.
Thank you so much. I don't know whether you remember this, Eddie, but I think for me personally, one of the highlights of that event, especially in retrospect, so for the benefit of everybody else, so we split all the teams into different groups, and there was one part of the competition where we had, there was a resource grab where the teams had to go and find, like construction paper and pencils to kind of do their prototype. And there was one group that was a little bit too slow, and they ended up with the sticky dots, that we use for voting for flip charts and whatever. So in their final presentation, they had a scene where they had one poor student covered in these sticky dots. And the premise of the scene, or how he set up the scenario, was that there was a global pandemic. Everybody became infected with something strange. And then because as a reaction to that, they did a mass vaccination program. And it turned out that the vaccination program was a population control measure. And because of that, there was a new political party that rose up that decided to charge the way forward into Mars. And in November 2019, it was very funny. But less than 2 months later, I find myself in the supermarket trying to panic buy face masks, right? So I think that for me really brought home, the relevance of these thought experiments, right? And being comfortable actually doing them, because, the reality is much stranger than fiction, right? So we never know. Yeah, I don't know whether you remember the crazy sticky dot presentation.
I do. And yes, well, no one's mentioned recently that our backup option is just let's all leave and go to Mars. Who knows? Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But I think that a key point you make there, though, is certainly something we learn in schools. And I think an attitude I find a lot of my colleagues have is almost a fear of having it's not even having an opinion, having permission to imagine how things could be again. Well, unless I've done all the research, or unless I've read the books, or unless I've been to 20 conferences, I couldn't possibly try and, I'm not professional enough to think about that scenario. And it's like these scenarios are relevant to all of us, as we've heard, for the person living in this new world, for the person being educated, for the person who's working in it or visiting it, or whatever your role might be. All of our collective life experiences are relevant. And having that permission to think so creatively. We've got to stop sort of knocking it out of people in childhood and going, no, we need more of that play.
Yeah,
we need more of that sort of flexibility. Yeah, and constant battle to keep those kind of conversations going, but well worth it.
Great, thank you so much. If it's okay, we'll move on to Farah. So Farah, I've seen a lot of you in the last month, Farah, because we've just come out of a very intensive period in June where we've done 2 back-to-back youth futures competitions, and you and the team, including 2 other trainers, April and another Eddie,
Yes.
you know, have introduced about 170 people from Singapore and across Asia to futures thinking. You know, I would really love to hear a little bit more about you reflecting on that experience, and also what skills you were trying to impart. You know, what do young people need to know about the future?
Wow. Yeah. What do young people do? Everything. Wow. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming down and taking the time to listen to our reflections and, you know, just our thoughts on this program and futures for youths, which is a very unique case because in futuring, the tendency is for like corporates, companies, strategic teams, governments to actually employ these skills to really craft scenarios and then do strategic planning around that. Bringing futures to youth is a very unique, but I think it should be more common, I think, in the long run, because it's really, really helpful. Because after all, they're going to inherit the future, and it's a skill in itself for you to like take on to do well, to be able to sustain the world in the long run, right? So in case people worry, right, like if you do, I just want to put out there, like I actually did an Instagram poll to ask, not poll, like question to ask people, like what do you really want to know about futures? Because I think there's a lot of people who are not too sure what futures thinking is about in the first place. I'm sure the audience are, some of them are, most of you already know about futures thinking, but I think those who don't know also like to ask questions around like, what is the difference between futures thinking and like, what do we do now as a strategist or design thinking, whatever that is, right? And so I realized that actually a lot of youths would have this kind of questions. And then when youths go out there, maybe after school, they start working and then they go through, they have to start doing like planning for the future. It's a skill that they could use to get there. Right, so when we did this program, so the Asian Undergraduate Summit, and then there's also the Singapore Futures Youth Conference, as one of the trainers and curriculum developers, together with Eddie Chu and April Chin and Cheryl and team, wonderful, wonderful team. We actually we wanted to frame it as a, I guess, a learning space for everybody. So there's a lot of like this kind of this spirit of abundance, and the more that we share, the more that we will learn. So insights were always welcome. So we almost at every stage of our learning, we would have the teams share what they had gone through so that they could give feedback to each other and you know, reflect on what they had learned. So the more we share, the more we learn. So I guess that's one of the skills that we're trying to go for, which is not very, I guess it's not very common, like this kind of learning community that we were trying to achieve. So I would say that, yeah, that's one of the few things that we really had in mind when we designed the program. I guess in futures thinking in itself, there's a lot of like critical thinking, right? So I think it's a very wonderful key term that a lot of teachers like to use. How do I get my kids to do critical thinking? I think when we do futures, we will get into critical thinking where we start to analyze trends, we will start to analyze emerging driving forces, things that would actually shape our future. We always talk about like, oh, these things shaped our past, our history, but there are also things that will shape our future. So when you look into all these things, how would they, you know, you have to actually start to like be a bit more discerning as to what the implications of these trends are. So we got through that with the AUS competition program, where they learned causal layered analysis. It's one of the tools that's available in futures thinking, where we get to have students or people just unpacking the issues that they identify today. They get to, I guess, critically look at the assumptions that they have and question whether these are we going to break out of these assumptions and move forward in a future where we actually have a new myth or metaphor that we want to uphold, new value system that we want to uphold. So that was very, very fun, seeing how their minds just blown. It's really like, what? This world is, this is how, if this is today's normal, then what is tomorrow's normal? I want to see. So there's that element as well. So the last thing also that we wanted to share or get people to doing is actually doing a lot more imaginative work. Like being imaginative is actually a muscle in itself. And yeah, it's a creative muscle, right? And doing it in a way that is like playful. So we really encourage them to like be creative in the way that you present. So it's not just going to be like a slide deck, and it's also a challenge also if it's online, right? So Eddie had the privilege of looking at all these materials and prototypes flown around. But fortunately, unfortunately, we actually saw things online. So I actually got to see Mariah's group where they had like a video of like people from the past who talk about, like, I think, if I'm not wrong, you're from the past and you talk about what's happening today and how it's like horrible. And then you get, they started to act for the next round. So it's like a video, like, yeah, it's very fascinating. I don't know what else. You can really go quite creative with this. So imagination and play, I guess, is very crucial in the futuring process that we try to impart to the youths. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I actually, it's quite interesting to as like we normally train executives, right? Where sometimes it's like play is beaten out of the curriculum. So I think for me, it's quite a nice reflection of actually how do you bring that back in, and actually it's valuable, right, in and of itself, and it can actually be a really wonderful creative source of energy. And insight, in a way that sometimes as adults, we don't feel like we have the permission, which is a bit sad, I feel.
Yeah. But it's also sad that it's like the youth themselves, right? Like you're at that age where you could, but it's a function of a system where you actually don't. And then when we tell them, you got to have fun and you got to play, and then the youth will be like, play, wait, what? But
so true.
Yeah, so we did get over that together. So eventually you have this amazing presentations by all these groups.
Yeah, so true.
Yeah,
so much of the trust the process, right? Like, wait for the magic to come out on day 5.
Yeah, it was really like miraculous.
Great, thank you so much, Farah. Okay, Mervin, over to you. So we work together on one of these big youth projects, the Asian Undergraduate Summit. And actually it's an ongoing event, that NUS partners with different universities to do. But actually Futures Thinking has not been a tool used in the summit in the recent years. So I'm curious as to your experience. Maybe if you could share a little bit about your reflections on why the organizing team was interested in using Futures tools, and what do you think some of the participants' kind of key takeaways were? I think that would be really nice to hear from you. Over to you, Mervin.
Thanks, Cheryl. Maybe before I start this sort of sharing, I'll give a brief introduction about the Asian Undergraduate Summit. So the Asian Undergraduate Summit was initiated in 2015. It aims to build a platform for undergraduates across Asia from various disciplines to come together and engage in meaningful academic and intercultural exchange. AUS 2021 is actually our 7th iteration of the event, and we saw the participation of over 120 student leaders from 17 schools over 10 countries, across 10 countries. Aside from this one of the main changes of this AUS 2021 was the fact that it was online due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But one of the other biggest shifts that you have mentioned is this shift from design thinking to futures thinking. So why did we decide to actually embark on this move? Well, we realized that COVID-19 was sort of a slap of realization of sorts. We saw how disruptive change sort of impacted our solutions that only target like the immediate future. And we were wondering, how could we work on developing leaders capable of anticipating change and like managing this sort of unprecedented kind of changes? And this sort of led us to the direction of kind of like future-proofing our ideas. And futures thinking sort of led itself that framework much better than design thinking, which is why we sort of switched. But the whole process of actually picking up futures thinking wasn't very smooth in the least, because in the beginning, we were sort of guided by this vague notion of what an alternate future sort of looks like. It's kind of a very starkly different approach to things, where we usually like identify a problem in current society and think about, how do we sort of resolve this? Where should we go from this here? But futures thinking begins with an end in mind. We think about possible futures that we could sort of turn towards. And in my honest opinion, I think that's the most difficult part about things. How do we proceed towards this sort of envisioned future, where we have no clue whether the decisions that we're making today can sort of impact the directions or where we are headed forward? And it's always easy to sort of make decisions on hindsight, but when we have nothing to work with, or a lot of, I think futures thinking has this concept called weak signals, where we pick up on trends in the current society. So how do we use this sort of framework to develop like a better understanding of how the future will look like in the future? And I think knowing that not everything is going to work and having to sit with this sort of uncertainty where there's no fixed answers or even a clear path forward, how do we sort of manage this, our sort of like expectation of things? And I think Farah and Cheryl was well put. They were saying, trust the process. And we were like, oh no, where do we go from here? I'm not sure if this is the right decision. And honestly, it was quite ridiculous at some points. But after we managed to look past like this sort of uncertainty, we saw the immense value of futures thinking as a sort of a mindset, a framework that we could learn. And it has the potential to be so deeply relevant to not just policymakers, but to everyday individuals as well. So what do I mean by this? It's sort of when you look at things from a further perspective, you think about things maybe 15 to 20 years down the road. Where do you want to be? Where do you see yourself? And then you think about steps to take from there. And we realize that there's so much value in being future oriented in that sense. Let's not just look at the immediate future. There are going to be changes that you're not going to anticipate. And how do we sort of challenge that? So in my perspective, we sort of changed to this framework because we felt that we needed a larger pool of individuals who are sort of invested in this framework to see beyond the immediate future. And this is where the youth come in. We provide like a sort of this injection of fresh new ideas and concepts. And I think that's sort of lacking, which is what Farah mentioned. Like we're also concerned about what are the fixed answers? What is the framework we should adopt? What's the model answer to things? But do we always have that? I don't think so. And I'm not suggesting that there's no sort of place for design thinking and futures thinking. I think these have often been compared and contrasted against. But I believe that we kind of need a greater balance of futurist perspectives. And in the capacity of a large international conference, I think it's pretty amazing because we can see the intermingling of ideas and perspectives on a much broader spectrum. And the concerns of individuals become very varied. We see that even amongst the international participants, they tend to raise like different ideas, things that sort of resonate with them deeply. And these kind of ideas do not come across if we only have like a Singapore sort of group of participation. In my own group, actually, we're concerned with uplifting the lives of indigenous people and thinking about what the future for them would look like when we sort of incorporate their lives with normal civilization. And I feel like this is not a topic that would generally be touched if we were just focused on Singaporeans. And after sort of like the whole sort of program feedback, we sort of got the feedback from all the participants, and I think the whole program itself was quite well received. And it's definitely a very beneficial framework that most students are sort of not aware about, as Farah will have rightly mentioned. And actually, maybe to just round it off, I'm going to drop a short video about the Asia Undergraduate Summit. So it's just like a sort of a plug. You guys can just take a look if you're interested and see what we actually did for the whole program. It's pretty long, but I'll hand back the time to Cheryl.
Great, thank you so much, Mervin. I think the first thing I'll say is that it's really, really not easy to pull this stuff off online. And definitely there's so much, there's a lot of complexity when it's online, but also you do lose a little bit, in fact, a lot, when you do take a format like this, to a two-dimensional world, but congratulations on actually pulling it off, right? I think it's really no small feat for you and your team, and so glad that you decided to take a chance on a new methodology, in a time like this. I think for me, one of the things I really enjoy the most, especially with the diversity of your group, because you have all across Asia, right, all partner universities and all that, is really just hearing what different people are concerned about, right? And as you mentioned, like actually some of these things, it may not even have occurred, might not even have occurred to me, right? Because it's just not my worldview or not my, not my challenges, but it's so wonderful because everybody shares the future, right? We have got a collective kind of burden of the future that we all have to carry together, right? So it's also really wonderful to hear that. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing. Great. Okay, I'm actually going to, and thanks everybody for starting to put some of the questions online. It's so wonderful to hear from the four of you, Mariah, Eddie, Farah, and Mervin. And let's go into a question, kind of open question, kind of part of the segment. And there was a question on the chat that I would like to try to pose to everybody while everybody else is thinking of what difficult questions they want to ask. So Lihan has put on the chat, what are some of the difficulties working with students on futures given that they have no prior background in futures? And then maybe a more Singapore specific question, what are the difficulties working with Singapore students? Because we do have a very, I would say, structured education system, and maybe it's a nice way to put it. But I'm also curious as to reflections on different education systems or working with youth, either more generally or, kind of, whether it's from the UK to some of our other Asian partners, that'll be wonderful. Can I open that to the four of you? I would be very curious to think about what are some difficulties you think we faced that for teaching futures to youth with no prior knowledge to futures.
Shall I offer a view?
Yeah, why not?
I wouldn't say that. So on the one hand, it's tricky for it. I think it's certainly the UK education system sounds like it might be similar to that in Singapore in terms of there's a lot of, as I said, let's learn the stuff to get through the exam, and there's that rote learning, and we're trying to quickly snap people out of that. On the other hand, I think actually young people not coming with the baggage of having a whole career's worth of having that creativity forced out of you, and maybe being a bit more open-minded about some of those different tools and techniques. And obviously there's loads of different models and sort of ways and methods that we can help people think more creatively, and some different devices to unlock different doors. Personally, I find that young people are far more receptive and willing to give it a go than maybe people who are further on in their career, who actually feel, well, I've got a set of methods, a set of competencies, and I'm at my most expert when I'm in my sort of safe zone. And so actually all the more reason why we need to engage with young people. What we do need to do though is to give young people, I think the confidence, as I said, to take the leap of faith that this slightly bizarre exercise is worth it, because it is a very different way of thinking, and actually trying to think 10 years ahead, 15 years, 20 years ahead, actually can sometimes feel quite irrelevant. But we notice, there's the famous saying, everyone overestimates what you can do in 2 years, underestimates what you can do over 10 years. And that longer timeline is so critical, where we can be bolder and we have to think more creatively. So personally, I don't think it's a challenge, as long as we just set those expectations and create a safe environment for people to take that leap of faith with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Farah.
Yeah, so I mean, as a Singaporean myself who grew up in a Singaporean education system, teaching futures to Singaporean youth, particularly for the Singapore Futures Youth Competition, yeah, what was challenging really is about that creativity, that imagination, and the permission that we have to give ourselves to be able to imagine. We're so used to the idea of like absorbing information from people and from our educators, and then maybe regurgitating that during papers and exams. When we, and I think the other thing is also not celebrating the weirdness around it. I was just reading up about this thing I was introduced to recently. It's called the Perceived Weirdness Index, and how it's actually helpful in organizational development and futures thinking. And I feel like there is a struggle in imagining the future for our youth in Singapore, particularly because we've always been very focused on exams, very focused on getting things right. So there's a permission-seeking attitude, and so that kind of difficulty, that kind of is a struggle for us to like invite them into this space of openness and just being crazy about it. I mean, it's guided craziness, I imagine. I mean, there's tools to help you get into this kind of imagining, this kind of space, but also we should celebrate it more. I think that's like for me, it's very important to be able to say, yeah, that's a weird question, but that's great, you know? So yeah, I think that's one of those things that I want to put for. Yeah.
Great. Maybe we can get the perspective of Mariah, since you're exactly this target market that we're talking about.
Oh yeah, definitely. I think as one of the recipients towards this new way of thinking, especially with futures thinking, I think it definitely did take a while to get used to, especially for, I guess, the earlier parts of the competition where a lot of explanations and like pushing had to be done. But I think that said, it kind of makes it more important and I guess more easier to facilitate when different groups of youth come together and just like take this time to like learn together and adjust to this new way of thinking. And I think especially since most of us come from different schools, this new insight that we've learned from this competition could potentially be something that we could spread to our own like respective spaces. Yeah, and I think it's definitely an uncomfortable journey, but it's one that brings about a lot of insight and is definitely worth thinking about. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, absolutely.
If I may
And
jump
I
in.
think, yes, of course.
Actually, I think one of the most difficult points that the rest of the panelists do have covered is the fact that it takes time for you to get used to futures thinking. And it's not something that we are comfortable with. But the thing is, most people actually want sort of immediate answers. So what's the right solution to things? But futures thinking isn't all about finding the right answers at times also. It's about trying to be more future oriented, trying to envision the future that you kind of want to happen. And this doesn't always guarantee answers in that sense. So I believe one of the biggest challenges is sort of playing this sort of waiting game, trying to know whether the sort of answers that you propose are leading you in the right direction, or you need to make some strategic changes along the way. And that's quite difficult among the youth because we sort of seek this, we are very solution oriented. We want to know what's the best way for me to get there from point A to point B. But I don't know. I don't think anyone knows. If I could do that, I would be a prophet. And I think that's one of the hardest part for me.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, to be fair, don't shortchange yourself, because all the executives we teach also have the same challenge, right? I mean, it's not a youth, it's not like it's a youth problem and then you magically grow out of it when you become an adult, right? I mean, even for the leaders that we teach, in fact, some of them might be even further entrenched into their current worldview and resist this uncomfortable, horrible process that everybody is trying to bring them through. So to be fair, right? I think that's it's a broader challenge. But thank you everybody so much for sharing your insights. I think that's I mean, I would say, I don't know, futures is like an anxiety coping mechanism, right? And I think if used effectively, it can, I mean, it's almost like mindfulness, right? It's just helping you be a little bit more mindful about the present that you have found yourself in, and this future, to use Eddie's term, that you might end up sleepwalking into, right? But just to be aware that this is, this thing is happening, I think in and of itself is a win. Yeah. There is a question, or there have been a couple of questions in the Q&A about post-COVID inclusive growth. And I wanted to pull that up because actually that was the theme, somewhat the theme of the Asian Undergraduate Summit. And of course, it came up a lot in our youth competition as well. So the question is framed as, how can Singapore promote inclusive growth? But I think maybe if I can have the permission to reframe the question a little bit, it's really, maybe if in some of the conversations we've had with young people, what are some of the questions, right, about post-COVID inclusive growth that have come up, in our recent events or in some of these futures conversations with youth? I'd be curious to hear some of your feedback.
If I may go first, I think one of those things that we really identified is that COVID itself has given us a chance to like really rethink about what we assume as true, as what we assume as normal. And so but it's also not just experienced by the people who are in the decision-making space only, right? It's everybody. Like basically humankind is now given the opportunity to really re-perceive our world. And so there is a need for us to actually listen to the various stakeholders, which is basically everybody really. And those who are not listened to are supposed to be listened to. Me, it should be listened to more lah. So I think like having the youths, right, like talk about this. One of those things that I realized that during the AUS summit was that they actually looked at growth that they no longer look at growth as like an economic thing, like you have to grow financially well, you have to prosper that way. But they also looked at wellness, healthcare, things that we have left behind, like indigenous rights, upholding our traditions, and how can that help shape our future as well. So I think that was really meaningful. So yeah, number one is actually to like listen out to other people, including the youth. Number two is actually to like really re-perceive the world because of what we hold true. We need to really look at that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else would like to take a stab at the question? I'm trying to make eyes at Mervin, but he can't tell that I'm thinking.
I can offer a UK perspective if that's helpful. I mean, just a whole range of, well, so COVID, I think, has highlighted a lot of existing inequalities and just really brought them into sharp relief, right? And I suspect that's true of countries right around the world. Certainly just seeing, even just within the public sector, there's people like myself who can work exactly like in this forum, can work online, costs have gone down, I can be safe in at home. Frontline workers out in the fields, lower paid, not having any of that kind of luxury or safety. And so that's an uncomfortable tension. We've also seen in a London context, just things like digital exclusion really coming up into prominence, with lots of young people having to learn from home. You don't have your laptop, if you don't have connectivity, if you don't have enough devices within a wider family, people literally being excluded from education, from training, from work, exacerbating their existing vulnerabilities. And so certainly in a London context, we're doing a lot now to go, we cannot ignore this issue that we've been aware about for a good decade or more. We now have to grab it by the horns and do something about it. And I hope, if we're clutching for silver linings from the COVID experience, is that once and for all, it gives us permission, funding, and the right to crack on and try and deal with some of these quite structural inequalities that have to be addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've been trying to use Futures as a platform to also ask this question about who owns the future, right? And who has a stake in the future. And I think that that's also why the diversity, and getting these diverse, including different perspectives is been such an important part of our own practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School, precisely for this reason, right? Because people do get left behind by change, right? And the future you want to create, even the most positive and wonderful future leaves people behind. So how do we start to think a little bit about that? Yeah, I'm gonna arrow Mervin since your whole conference was on this topic.
Okay, thanks for the arrow, I guess, Cheryl. Actually, I was about to speak also, but I think Farah and Eddie made very good points about actually, just to add on to Farah's point and maybe to follow up on Eddie's point. So I think one important aspect that we tend to miss out on is trying to understand the different voices, or trying to know whether our solutions are inclusive in the first place. Because sometimes we all have our own interpretation of how things should look like. And at the same time, we don't include the different stakeholders. So if you want to look towards inclusive growth, you need to listen to the voices for others, because they are the people you're trying to resolve the situation for. You can't just be, oh, I think this is what works for you, please adopt my solutions. That's far too short-sighted. You can't just say, oh, this is the direction that people should look at, because that's not how it works. Because there are certain things that you only can know if you are working from the ground, or you are the people who are getting these sort of changes being implemented towards. So listening to voices is one of the most important things that I think people are missing. Maybe to address the more post-COVID sort of situation, Eddie raised an important point about this digitalization. So we are seeing a much greater sort of uptake of this digitalization. But I think one point I want to stress upon is how these changes are being communicated to people. So we can't just look towards promoting digital growth and these changes in digital, but we are leaving behind people who don't know how to adopt to these new changes. So inclusive growth needs to think about the people who are being left behind. How do we bring them forward in this future that we want to see? Because the future, like Cheryl mentioned, it's about thinking about who does the future mean. Who gets to decide the future? I think it's everyone. It's not just the youth, the adults with this sort of like increasing, what's the right word? Age group, not the lifespan, sorry. Yes, lifespan. Yes, lifespan. I mean, the future holds very different things, and we need to make sure that these people are kept in the loop. And that's sort of how we can look towards a more sort of inclusive growth in a post-COVID era. And to address sort of Cheryl's questions about which areas seems to be in focus, I think issues about sustainability has been on the rise. People are talking about green financing, sustainable. I think there's a lot of focus in that area for a reason, because attending one of those minister dialogue actually just yesterday, I think one point that the minister raised was that COVID-19 could just be a dress rehearsal of what are the more sort of crazy changes that could happen in our near future. And this is something that we need to sort of be certain about. We need to think about how can we manage this sort of our resources in this finite world. Yeah, hope that answers the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. I mean, I think one of the things I observed also in our youth competition, the Singapore Futures Youth Competition, was that actually nobody talked about growth. You know, we asked all these groups to share their topics, right? And actually, you know, to me, it was very also eye-opening, you know, having run back-to-back competitions, right? To even just to understand actually what are the real issues that are on young people's hearts. And my generation would have probably been much more economic growth kind of obsessed, I would say, you know, but actually that is shifting too, right? You know, like, you know, Mariah's group was the future of recreation, right? You know, almost the kind of antidote maybe, you know, to the crazy grind culture, you know, economic growth hustler kind of mentality. Yeah, so I think that's also interesting as well. Any further thoughts before we move on to the next question? Everybody okay? Okay, so I'm gonna ask, we had a question about best practices. So I will read the question verbatim, which says, what are some of the best practices Singapore has learned over the years when adapting future skills and teaching them to others? But I think best practices for the context of this particular webinar, I think best practices in teaching youth, I think would be also a really important angle to think about. And definitely not just Singapore. I mean, to be honest, we haven't been doing it for that long. Definitely not at the Lee Kuan Yew School, you know, and we've just ramped up very suddenly, very quickly, but we have not been doing it for that long. So I'd be curious as to what do you think works, you know, when trying to help people to learn future skills, to teach future skills, and democratize it, right? You know, to youth across society. Curious as to some of your thoughts. Maybe I'll start with Farah, since that's all you did that's the main thing you did in June.
Oh man, I was like, oh, there's a lot of things to think about when it comes to teaching youth. And I'm still, I mean, because it just ended last week also, right? So I'm still reflecting quite deeply about how it's a unique experience. First of all, it's virtual. So virtual fatigue is real. So one of those things I had to do in one of the sessions was to actually teach breathing techniques to cope with virtual, I don't know, stress. My cheekbones hurt from smiling too much in this particular seminar. But I think one thing that I would put aside is actually to like cope in this virtual world in the first place. So for youths, they are experiencing it for the first time. For us, we also work and we learn about things that make us uncomfortable as adults, right? Like, okay, how should we deal with it? But for youths, younger, I would imagine they're like really children. They're learning about like how to deal with this in a way that, they just don't know how to deal with it. So I think one of those things I had to do was actually to like remember that we are center ourselves into this space of, we're in the virtual space. So we start off with that. The other thing so the question was about like the things that we need to teach youth again. Was it Cheryl?
Yeah, best practice.
Best practice. Okay, so I mean, this is for any futurist, but I think for youth, it's good to start young. Before you could even like question the assumptions that you have about what you've experienced or learned about so far. I think having a pulse, that desire to continuously understand the world, and taking a pulse at the things that's happening around the world is a very important skill to have, important habit to inculcate. So reading is one way, but also I think we've been very privileged to open up the platform to have people from all different walks of life and different nationalities to be in this space, right? So that they can share their perspectives. So one of those things that I would really encourage youth is actually to make more friends that is outside your circle. I mean, I would say that to myself actually, but like I would tell everybody, the youth especially, that yeah, you have to realize that you're also in a bubble, as if you will move on in life in many bubbles, and then keep them around to actually, learn different perspectives of people. Yeah. So this mindfulness is a major thing for me to like share with the youth.
Fantastic. I see Eddie's unmuted himself, so I feel like have I just put you on the spot?
Only to make a brief point, and that maybe just recognizing there's potentially a little bit of a tension between having enough time. I think what worked so well was having several consecutive days. As we've said, people need to ease into this to sort of grow their comfort level and do it. The tension between that and actually trying to democratize this so the maximum number of people can get involved and trying to make it quite mainstream, or a mainstream part of education ideally is what I'd love to see in schools. So it's how do we encourage educators to carve out the time to allow people to enter this new kind of way of thinking so that they can get the full benefits of it. But if we can convince people that it's worth it, I'm sure that will come.
Fantastic. Thanks so much.
I think there was a question that was similar to that in the question list about institutionalizing or making it something that is involved in our curriculum. Yeah, I'm an advocate for futures for youth, and I really do think that at some point we actually could use this as an opportunity to get youth involved through the education system. But also, I think we have to be very clear that this is not about a solution finding process. This is not about getting it right exactly. Which is very different from the current education system, where we are not exploring, we're more of targeting and getting things right. So we do need to come into this space with a lot of open-mindedness. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm curious from Mariah's perspective, what works on you? What's the best practice from your perspective? Because you are the end user.
Must be because I tell her to go and have fun. Must have fun.
For sure. I think for me especially, while accessibility is definitely a thing, I think it'll be good if we could further integrate this idea of futures thinking into the wider education system in Singapore. But I think to add on to Farah's point earlier about youths having to step out of their own bubble, I think as great as it is for youths nowadays to be more, I guess, generally quite passionate about the topics that they hold close to their heart, I think it's also equally important to integrate the different perspectives from different age demographics, because I think especially for my generation currently, it's really easy to trivialize the opinions of the older generation as being more close-minded or traditional, for example, or let's say the younger generation as too childish. But I think in the end, regardless of our age, we all have something to bring to the table, and we are all responsible for like shaping the future that we have. So I think it's the ability to actively listen and to consider everyone's viewpoints would be one big thing to consider. Yeah,
and I hope that's not just a future skill. But just something broadly that all of us can adopt as well, for sure. And actually, maybe that's a good way to segue into Roberto's question. How to listen, really listen to the voice of people? Is it polls, questionnaires, big data? And actually, I mean, and of course, there's the reality of not being able to have everybody participate in maybe a foresight process. I mean, even though we ran so many workshops, at the end of the day, it was still 200 people, right? Like it's not, it's not a cohort of people. Yeah, so curious as to, I guess, maybe what steps or what ideas we can take to kind of further democratize some of these some of this for young people as well. I mean, definitely we are thinking about how to scale our events next year. Our team's been a bit scared to think about it. But maybe after a bit more sleep, we'll be a little bit more amenable to the idea. But that's one question that we ask ourselves as well, right?
I think governments have got to really sort of up their game on this as well. If you think of the traditional ways they consult with the public, it's very much like, here's what we're planning to do anyway. Would anyone like to comment on it? Or like, here's a petition form. And I think trying to think at the broader range of tools, and actually some of the sort of the behavioral psychology about how people engage, how they feel permission to engage, the accessibility questions we've heard of. I think there's we need to adapt the system so it's not government says, right, we're just going to do something and thank you very much, everyone else can just share their view on it. Actually shifting the process so people have got a chance to shape it, to see how their thoughts can influence it. And that's a massive journey. I think certainly national governments have to go on. It's probably more possible. The light at the end of the tunnel I see is to do it at a city level, where there's some real local people influencing what happens in local places. Easier to do it there, but I hope, again, the COVID experience where we've seen, what people think, what they do, their cooperation deeply matters, and getting their views early in the design stages. I'm very keen to try and figure out how we can do that in London, and I'm sure other cities will be thinking the same.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Any other further thoughts, question, like participant? Well, I mean, I think it's broadly a participatory foresight question also. How do we kind of scale it, We're also shocked at like doing 100 people plus events already. We were like, scale? Oh God. Yeah, I mean, I think from the school's perspective, and I think the way that we've tried to conduct our futures work, I think the first point is also there needs to be a democratization of the tools themselves, right? So like futures thinking, methodology, the process, and in these youth competitions that we've been running, we see ourselves as the kind of guardian of the tools, I suppose, right? And it's our job to kind of pass that on. I do think the next level of evolution will be also thinking a little bit about the content side, right? Because it's actually quite difficult for somebody who is not in this business with the luxury of time to, read widely and, about the future. There has to be a democratization of the content and the insights as well, because if not, there's a lot of information asymmetry about the future. Right, and the ability to talk meaningfully about the future actually can be constrained by the fact that actually nobody's talking about the same thing, right? And there are a lot of assumptions there. Yeah, I'd be curious for Mervin or Mariah, like what would have worked for you guys if you had to think about 10x the size of the workshop? What might have worked for you?
Sorry, as in referring to how we can listen to the voice of people, or something?
I mean, it's a kind of a participatory kind of question, right? How do we kind of include more people in the process?
Okay, I think it's definitely a sort of a balancing act. I think the best sort of solution is when you can balance your time and how much information you can sort of process in the meantime. I guess to answer, I think it's Roberto's question more directly. Mm-hmm. So how do we actually listen to a voice? As much as possible, I want to say, listen to each individual, find out what they have to say about things, because they are the people whose voices matters in this kind of thing. But we don't have the luxury of time, and we don't have that much space to sort of listen to everybody. And then it always boils down to, I think, questionnaires and big data. You kind of need a representative view from everyone around the world. Actually, or whoever you are trying to help, you need to firstly identify your communities. And in that sense, once you identify your community, then you can scope it down to a much more manageable group. And from there, I think that's how you can sort of listen to their voices. But your surveys need to be targeted. You need to know what is it you're trying to help with, and is it who you're trying to help, and whether these methods will work for them. Like, what are the current challenges? And I think that's how we can sort of listen to the voice of people, yet at the same time manage the constraint of not being able to listen to everyone, because everyone has a different experience, and it doesn't mean that no one's experience is more important than the other, but it's a matter of how we can sort of manage this bigger picture of things and sort of make it much more manageable to develop solutions. So I think that's how I would propose to listen to the voices of people.
Great. Any further thoughts, comments?
I think not everybody can put things into words. And I think when I was, so my experience in tutoring is not just to work with, I work with youths, I work with civil society mainly. So in the past, I used to work in an organization where we would do Future Fridays. So we open it to the public to have people to come in and learn some new futures tools and then use them to apply them to like topics on future of transport or future of work. So that's really fun. So this kind of participatory process means that we try to involve everyone, and not everyone, and we are aware that not everybody can like, I guess, articulate what they think about the future or what they feel about the future. And we will try to do things like making games out of it, making prototypes out of things, play with Lego. I think that was really fun to craft that future using Lego, for example. So there are many creative ways in hearing people's voices. So we call it participatory futures. So that's the idea here is that people who don't conventionally talk about it, like they don't know how to say it in words, would be able to say that in other forms. The other thing I also would like to bring up is that to hear the voices of the unheard, like you really have to listen to what is not said, and by whom is not said. So I think this kind of hyper awareness of who is speaking and who is not speaking is very important. So that kind of silence actually is louder than the usual. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So true. Maybe to pick up on another kind of question is, so and I think this comes up a lot in these kind of future of youth conversations, right? Which is like, is the now what question, right? You know, you've done, there were some questions in the chat about like, oh, is the futures competition a once off, you know, and that kind of thing. What are the outcomes? How do you take it to the next stage? And to be honest, on our end, they are designed to in and of themselves, right? Like they have value in and of themselves, and I think that's an important first step. We were joking with the team, right, to say that yeah, I mean, you know, we're not going to make everybody futurist tomorrow, you know, but if you all have, you know, learn some new things, meet some new people, it's you know, it's really a big step forward. But futures thinking in schools or like in a formalized curriculum, you know, do we get the Ministry of Education to look at it? Like what's the deal? What do we do? What's the next step? Yeah.
Don't grade it.
A for futures.
You got A. Oh, okay. That's not a point. You're very creative. No. So, yeah, I think that's for me is the mindset in the first place and why we're doing this. Yeah, that has to be clear and that has to be advocated. Really, and we're doing this because it matters to us on an existential level, and that this is something that we will keep in mind and like use as a way to live better and more sustainably. Yeah.
I think there's a public policy argument on this as well. And again, we've said education systems traditionally teach by rote, but if we're looking at sort of the changes to our economies, the change of the nature of work, governments must be recognizing pretty soon that the nature of work is not anything like those kind of skill sets. It's about, as I've said, that sort of lateral creative problem solving. And so I hope the penny will drop and we can try and urge them and lobby them to realize these are profound changes that to be sort of thriving economies, whether on a well-being or an economic growth front, we need to equip young people with those skills. I also hope that businesses, public sector and third sector organizations who recognize how important these skills are will also maybe try and offer some more of these experiences, just as you've done from a university level, to make sure that we're opening up that bringing in that creative thinking, recruiting the next generation of talent, because again, all of those organizations will need that type of creative thinking, and to get it in, right from the ground up, particularly if their existing staff may be less comfortable with these methods. So really trying to appeal to government and businesses' own interest to cultivate these skills and to invest in it, I think is promising and also important.
Fantastic. I'm curious from both Mervin and Mariah's perspective, because both of you are still in school in some shape or form. If there was futures thinking in the curriculum, what in your ideal world, what would that look like? What would be useful for you? I'm curious too. And not another graded module, I'm assuming. Does it look like summer school? Does it look like, like more competitions?
Actually, I think it was an interesting point that was raised by Lee Han, if I'm not wrong. So if we were to make it a graded module, I think there would be too much pressure and stress to do well. Especially you'll be like, oh no, what am I doing this right? And that sort of amplifies the sort of pressure of wanting to find the right answer, but I don't have the right answer. And I think it's quite an interesting idea, because we also sort of explored it in for our own summit. So we were saying, what if we can make these solutions more sustainable? Because we're taking so much time and effort to bring such brilliant minds together, try to have these ideas to bounce off each other and sort of grow this sort of concept. But then we're not taking it further. So at least what I was talking to my team is that we could sort of grow this sort of event and make it such that when we conceptualize such competitions, we do it for the sake of resolving a certain issue, or maybe have a direct sort of takeaway. We want to bring it further, and that's something that we are hoping to work towards for the next few summits as well. So on that front, maybe the competition level, we can try to make sure that the solutions are not just a one-off sort of event, and that they have actually consequences in real society, because some of the solutions were definitely much more well thought of, and this also means that we need to give a lot more time. And maybe in that front, we could also definitely turn into more of an academic module, maybe something like a non-graded UE, where the students can SU at the higher levels, or even as a curriculum at the lower level, junior college, or even secondary school levels, where they can sign up for this program. I think there's a lot of value in that. Maybe Maria want to chime in on this.
I think the idea of integrating futures thinking into our formal curriculum would be definitely a really interesting one. But I guess for me, the way I see it, rather than implementing it as a formalized subject into our education system, I think it'll be much more insightful if it were perhaps to be integrated into, I guess, a newfound way, or like a newfound means of approaching our mindset towards learning. Because I feel like, yeah, the whole notion of futures thinking is a really abstract topic that's hard to teach, but much rather is something that's to be learned. And I think if we were to use that as a means of reframing the whole idea of teaching education to the youths, it would be something that'll be, I guess, more natural for them to pick up. And I think going on to, I guess, the earlier question about how to make this whole idea of futures thinking much more accessible to others, and how we're able to listen to their voices, I think this is also a responsibility that isn't solely meant to be shouldered by the organizers of these large-scale events itself, but it's also something that the recipients have to factor into, because we are the ones that receive this newfound information, and therefore it's also our part to play to further disseminate that to the broader community. And I think that apart from a formalized setting where we introduce futures thinking formally, we could also introduce it in a more casual way by integrating it into our daily conversations with other people. Because I guess in the end, listening to other people doesn't always have to be for the benefit of thinking of a better future. It's also out of a place of compassion to hear about the many different and unique lives that other people go through and have. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. No, I mean, I think the thing I'm taking away from what you're saying, Mariah, is also that is form versus substance, right? It's there's so much underlying futures. Actually, there's a lot of other skill sets, right? So including, listening better, trying to imagine, different futures, trying to read up more widely, critically, and actually if we get those right, actually a lot of the future stuff kind of falls into place in many ways. Sometimes when I'm invited to some of these youth events to talk, and I was once invited to a future of work session, and I said, okay, I will agree to speak on the condition that I do not make any predictions about the future of work, because I don't want to go into a high school or a junior college and then be like, hey, these are the 6 jobs you need to do to be employed in 2040. It's like, I don't know. I have no idea, right? And it was really interesting that actually that conversation about, fundamentally it's about being comfortable about making decisions in uncertainty, but still trying to do that in a somewhat sensible, some sensible way, and a playful way, right? And a curious way, and actually that is good enough, right? Yeah. We do have more time for one last question, and I think one theme that has come up in a lot of the Q&A is, how did you get started in this kind of work? How do I get started in this kind of work? What are the books to read, things to recommend? Your favorite YouTube/podcast. We're really, really interested to hear a recommendation from perhaps each of you. Maybe one tip on how to get onto your little futures thinking journey. Something that's worked for you. Yeah.
I'm not.
Farah?
Oh, I'll go first. Oh, yeah, really.
Yes.
I'm not very extroverted. I mean, 50-50 really. But I do like to make friends from everywhere and hear their thoughts on things. Like really, whether you're from Singapore or what is, different people have different upbringing and different environments that they're in. So my one tip is actually to make more friends and like really trying to understand where they're coming from. And their perceptions of the world, which is really fascinating because it really goes to show what do they care more. And when you like reflect on it, then you can actually, as a futurist, start thinking, right, these are the things that are important, and that's going to be the mindset that people are going to move forward with it. Also, these are the main, like maybe trends or things that are happening in their countries that will inevitably shape the way that we work in the future in the first place. Yeah, so that's from me.
Great. Anyone else? Tips, tricks, hacks? I love life hacks.
Well, I'd say in part, avoiding over specialism. Again, another thing our education and so professional lives encourage us to do is to really hone down into specific domain expertise. And for me, across all the jobs I've done over the last few years, all of them have boiled down to helping people think about their problems differently and making them realize that there's more doors open to them than they perhaps thought was possible, which is kind of, one of the things we hope comes out of future thinking. And one of the ways I feel I've been able to prompt some of those conversations in a real work setting is to say, okay, let's imagine if the concepts we see in like biology, we took that sort of thing, how would that make us think differently about this context in a public sector context? Or what can we learn from the entertainment industry or philosophy, or like reading widely and making sure we're resisting this urge to become more and more specialist, more and more stuck in an intellectual as well as a person bubble, I think is so important. So never lose your curiosity about things utterly unrelated to whatever the thing is you're working on, because I think that will serve you really well.
Wonderful. Staring at either Mariah or Mervin.
maybe to just sort of chime in on what Eddie mentioned. I think on this point of curiosity, maybe you can just start by asking simple questions, challenging the assumptions that they are in place. Why do you think certain things are being done this way? Is it right? Is there a better way of doing things? I think once you have this sort of mentality and the flexibility of wanting to challenge the assumptions that we hold in place, and think about them on a much deeper level, I think that's a very wonderful way to get started on futures thinking. And beyond that also, the internet is a wonderful place for you to answer any of your questions. Actually, just from a simple Google, you can actually find out quite a lot of your answers there about what you need to know. And I think Cheryl probably posts quite a bit on futures thinking as well, so you can follow avid avid fans or futurists who have a lot of sharings on these aspects. And that's sort of how you begin your journey. You take baby steps and you start thinking about things on a broader perspective. And that's sort of my life hack, I guess.
Love it. Mariah.
I guess for me, it's just to generally channel that sense of open-mindedness whenever we bring in like newfound perspectives into the conversation. I think we'd have to learn that uncertainty is definitely inevitable when it comes to talking about the future. And with uncertainty comes with a lot of fear. But we have to know that fear is okay. And because all of us share that equal sentiment for wanting a better future, we all play a part in shaping it. And therefore, we should all continue to listen to one another and rely on each other to see what better we can do for others in the future.
Wonderful, wonderful. I have two recommendations, books, just because I'm sitting in front of my bookshelf. Okay. Oh dear. Burp. I'm going to turn off my... Can you see that? Rebecca Solnit, The Field Guide to Getting Lost. So that's one book recommendation. It's more reflections than a futures book about getting lost and how we are losing the ability to get lost, right? To be comfortable in getting lost, to wander, to explore new places, you know? And I think it was, I read it at the beginning of the year and thought it was such a beautiful reflection on in many ways, a futurist kind of posture, right? To be comfortable with this uncertainty that Mariah talked about and say, well, actually, I'm quite okay to go and get a bit lost in the future for a bit. And that would be wonderful. The second one is to plug a fantastic book written by a friend, if you can see it, How to Future. So it's How to Future, Leading and Sense-Making in an Age of Hyperchange by Scott Smith and Madeline Ashby. Very nicely written lay person, I would say, introduction to futures work. You know, so taking you through a futures process, but not in an overly technical way. So I think that that's really great. So Rebecca Solnit, A Field Guide to Getting Lost, and Scott Smith and Madeline Ashby, How to Future would be my two book recommendations. And maybe the closing thought for our webinar is to say that the future is complex and potentially extremely contested a space. But if you can find friends to work with on these thorny issues, you know, it's possible to create a better future. So I'm very thankful to the four of you, Mariah, Eddie, Farah, and Mervin, for collaborating with us, you know, over the last month intensively, but over the years as well. We've been so wonderfully blessed by your support and yeah, sharing of ideas. And thank you so much for spending this time with us on this webinar to also share your experience on futures. Really, really thankful for that. So with that, thank you everybody for joining us in this webinar today. I hope that you've had some food for thought, you know, to think a little bit about how you might be developing the next generation of futurists. As usual, you know, because this is a webinar series, we would love to hear your feedback. So there's a QR code for some of, if you can be so kind as to scan the QR code and fill up some feedback. That would help us out a lot, especially for future topics, you know, things you want to discuss, that kind of thing. That would be really, really wonderful. Next episode. So we try to do this every other month. So thinking a little bit about institutionalizing futures in the public sector, you know, would be really curious also to have this discussion, right? So not just, you know, it came up today as well, right? Like, how do you put in the school system? How do you, you know, start futures teams? You know, what does it look like in a curriculum? What does it look like for training? Things like that. I think those are starting to be quite important questions as well. What does futures thinking look like in the public service? That would be fantastic. Yes, the webinars are recorded and we do share that on our YouTube channel. So please go and look for this and all our previous webinars there and all our other fun LKY school executive education videos are also there. So please, please go and find us on YouTube as well. Do follow us on LinkedIn. You know, we are very active on LinkedIn as well. So other programs that are coming up, these are all open enrollment programs. As you know, our department is not just futures. We specialize in public policy, you know, and public sector education more broadly. So if you're interested in communications or policy development, innovation in the public sector, those are all things that we would love for you to join us for. That would be really great. Yes, and please keep in touch. If anybody wants to collaborate, find out more about programs, connect with us on LinkedIn, please email / click all the links. And we would really love to hear from you. We are, of course, in the process of ramping up our futures work at Executive Education, and it's been a very intense and exciting 6 months for us. So we're very happy to explore different collaborations for the next 6 months and into the future. And I think with that, the last thing I have to say is really, once again, thank you very much to our wonderful panelists and guests, Mariah, Eddie, Farah, and Mervin, for sharing so generously and eloquently, and thoughtfully your experiences in futures. I know some of you are much newer futurists than others, but really, really wonderful to hear your reflections, right? And I do hope that this would be the start of a weird and wonderful journey for all for all of you. And please, of course, keep in touch. We'd love to see you on our campus at some point in the near future, I hope. So with that, thank you, everybody. I really do appreciate your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this webinar.